Hello, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today, Application Tips for Applying in Round 3. My name is Nelly, and I'll be the moderator on behalf of the Unimi team. And I'm here with a very special guest, our speaker today. I want to present Chelsea Hann, Associate Director of Admissions at Cornell, who will guide you on how to submit a successful application in Round 3. Before giving the word to her, I want to tell everyone who is listening you can ask questions anytime during the webinar just using the Q&A box. We will take time to answer at the end of the session. And of course, all questions are welcome, so don't hesitate. I think everything is working, everything is set now, and I'm giving the word to you, Chelsea.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Nelly. As Nelly mentioned, my name is Chelsea Hann. I'm Associate Director of Admissions and Scholarship at Cornell Johnson, and I'm really excited to be with you today to share some of my best application tips for those looking to apply in round 3. These are actually some really great tips and takeaways that you could use even if you're not submitting an application in round 3. Maybe you're thinking about next fall or even the following cycle, and that's totally okay. Make sure that you jot some of these down. They can certainly be applied really anytime that you're thinking about submitting your application for business school. I'm also really excited to be joined today by one of our most fantastic alums. She is truly one of our best. Her name is Melody Lamb. She's from the class of 2020. I will pause for a moment and have her introduce herself as well.
Okay. Hi, everyone. My name is Melody. Hope I'll be able to see you sometime around your sometime if you decide to join Johnson. I'm currently in New York City. I work at Uber as part of their strategy team. So yeah, as Chelsea mentioned, I was part of the class of 2020. When I was at Johnson, I was part of the consulting club, Women's Management Council. I was also a Park Fellow and part of the consortium. So happy to meet you all, and I look forward to chatting with you today.
Thank you, Melody. That's perfect. She was certainly no shortage of activities, very, very involved while she was on campus. So I'm excited for you all to hear from her today. Let's get started with first thinking about applying in round 3 and submitting an application. Our round 3 deadline is going to be approaching just about 2.5 weeks from now on April 11th. And I put some frequently asked questions and some FAQs on here that I think candidates oftentimes think about when they're approaching whether or not to apply in round 3. The first question is, are there seats available? It is at the later end of the admissions and application cycle. We do have 2 rounds that have already passed, one in the fall and one in January. So I think a lot of candidates are wondering whether or not there's still seats in the class available and whether or not it's worth applying in April or in round 3. And I think generally the answer to that is if your application is at its best in April and in round 3, then certainly you should submit your application and you should apply. There are still seats available. We do make offers of admission to applicants that apply in round 3 every year. There are less obviously scholarship dollars available than there are in the earlier rounds in which you apply, just because we've given so many out already for the round 1 and round 2 applicants, but we do, again, still admit applicants in round 3 with scholarship. So if your application is truly at its strongest and at its best in round 3, then you should still consider submitting your application. The next question that we often get from applicants thinking about whether or not to apply in round 3 is from an international candidate perspective, and should they apply in round 3? And the answer to that is it depends. I think you should be very thoughtful about the region in the country for which you're coming from and whether or not your visa timeline would allow for you to start the program, let's say at the end of July or early August. So you might need to do a little bit of due diligence and research on your end to see what the timeline looks like for obtaining a student visa to study here in the US, and then think about whether or not you should submit in round 3, or if you should actually hold and submit your application in the earlier rounds for the next cycle. One of my biggest tips for those that are considering applying in round 3 is tell us why now. Why at this point are you submitting an application? And really, there's no wrong answer to this, but it's often a question in our minds when we're evaluating candidates in round 3. Is this maybe something that you just decided to start very recently and you were a little bit later on in the MBA application process, and that's why you're submitting for one of our later rounds? Is it because maybe the schools that you applied to in the earlier rounds didn't work out the way that you hoped, and Johnson maybe became later on your list, later into the cycle? And again, that's totally okay, but give us some of that helpful context and help us understand why you're moving forward with your application in round 3. My last tip and piece of advice is that applying in round 3 can actually help to build a pretty solid foundation for fall of 2024. So if maybe you're not sure whether or not your application will be at its best truly in round 3, start to put the pieces together. Start to gather and create some of those application materials. Think about your essay submissions and who might be a good person to write your letter of recommendation. And then you can decide, I feel like I'm ready and I have all of my materials together to submit in April. Or if not, maybe you need a little bit more time and that's okay, but you should have a good plan and strategy for moving forward over the summer so that you can submit a really solid application for round 1 the next fall. Let's now transition and talk about some of the specific components and aspects of the application. I'm going to give you some of my best tips for the primary components of the application. We'll start with the one that I think causes candidates the most stress and perhaps anxiety, but academics. So when we are evaluating a candidate's academic aspect of the application, we're actually looking at quite a few different things. It's not just the test score and the transcript, but I am going to walk through the various components that we do take a look at. So we're trying to get a sense for whether or not this person can handle the rigor and pace of the MBA program. And what we look at to try and answer that question, yes, of course, the test score, the GMAT or the GRE. I wrote if required in parentheses because this year there are a few schools that are actually offering GMAT and GRE test waivers as part of their applications. There's a couple of different reasons for that. One of them, one of the primary reasons is actually because of COVID and candidates having maybe limitations and difficulty getting access to testing centers. So some schools do have an option to request a test waiver. We are one of them. Applicants can go into our application and request a test waiver. And I have my second question here of who should request a test waiver, because I think it's important to talk about this a little bit. The test waiver is not for everybody, and you should be thoughtful about your academic profile and whether or not it tells the admissions committee that you are in a place to handle the rigor and pace of the MBA program without the test score. So what does your undergraduate transcript say about your academic profile and your academic readiness? Did you study something more quantitative in nature? Do you have any quant classes on your transcript? What were your grades like? What's your overall GPA? What's the quality of the institution that you attended? What type of work experience are you doing? Are you working with data or managing a budget or doing anything in Excel or with numbers? Those are all things that we take a look at to get a sense for whether or not this person is in a place to do well academically. So sort of think through that process before you decide whether or not you should be submitting the test. The next thing we will look at, of course, are your transcripts, undergraduate and graduate transcripts, and your overall GPAs from both, in addition to any non-degree coursework that was taken. We want to get a sense for all of the classes that you've taken, the types of classes. Did you challenge yourself? What was your trajectory and overall performance like? Did it go up? Did it go down? Did you struggle in any consistent way during your undergrad experience? What other things were you involved in? How were you able to prioritize and manage your time? Were you maybe involved heavily in extracurriculars, or were you on a sports team? Did you balance a part-time or full-time job while you were in school? And all of those things paint the full picture and story of your academic profile, but those are the types of things that we're going to be looking at when we take a look at your transcripts. The last thing is your TOEFL or your IELTS, which is your English language proficiency exam. And those are required for any applicant whose native language is not English, unless you studied for at least a year in a fully English speaking institution. The next component of the application is the resume. And I think this one is really important to talk about because it's oftentimes utilized. So I want to talk about the purpose of the resume. It's oftentimes utilized as really a focal point and a reference point for the person reviewing your application. I personally, when I review applications, I have 2 screens up and I keep the resume up pretty much throughout my entire evaluation. And I use that as a reference point as I'm reviewing the rest of the application. So you do want to make sure that it's clean, it's easy to read, and it's accurate. That's the most important thing. In terms of format, I have an example here on the slide. This is actually a Johnson Business School resume template. And these are like public resources. You can Google business school resume templates and use that as a reference point when you decide to build your own resume for your business school applications, which is something that you should be doing. It's really important that you create a resume specific for MBA applications. You don't want to use the resume that you use to apply for jobs in your industry. Oftentimes, those are very specific to the role that you have or the industry that you're in. There's sometimes a lot of technical jargon or technical language that somebody outside of your industry oftentimes can't understand. So you want to make sure your resume is formatted and using language that somebody like me who reads resumes and applications all day long can easily understand and digest. Some of the things that you should be very conscious about when you create your resume, making sure that you're quantifying your achievements and giving us context rather than listing out qualitatively your different responsibilities and the tasks that you do on a day-to-day basis. Help us understand the impact that you've had and your progression and your trajectory. We want to see whether or not you've been promoted or had any type of increased scope of responsibility throughout your professional experience. If you have any professional gaps, make sure that those are addressed and that you communicate that to the admissions committee. It's not uncommon that we see candidates applying to business school, especially this year post-COVID and with a lot of the layoffs that are happening in society with a gap. And that's okay. I would say anything above maybe 3 months or so should be something that you're explaining in your optional essay to the admissions team. Help us understand what happened and how you spent that time. You should be prepared to explain any gaps the same way that you would explain a gap to a recruiter if you were applying for a job. My last biggest tip for the resume is to make sure that your dates and your timelines are accurate. You don't want to do anything that will create outstanding questions or cause of concern for the committee. So your dates and titles and the timeline should align perfectly and match what you're putting in your application work history section of the application. If those dates are off, those titles don't match, the companies don't match, that's going to cause more questions than anything else. And you want to make sure that those are pretty much identical as the person evaluating your application is taking a look at your work experience and your progression. Those are some of my biggest tips for the resume and the purpose and how we use it when we're evaluating applicants. I would like to pause here and ask Melody if she would like to chime in and share any of her biggest tips for candidates that are approaching building a resume for business school applications.
I feel like you touched upon a lot. Yeah, I agree with what Chelsea said with resumes. Keep it as concise and easy to read as possible. One of the big tips that I learned during pre-term at Johnson was a lot of recruiters look at your resume for 6 seconds before they start deep diving into all the different bullet points. So you kind of have to be like mindful of the reader's experience of the resume, because if it's very lengthy and you're not able to talk about what is most meaningful about your experiences, like what are your achievements, then it's really easy to skip over your resume over some other candidates. So I would imagine what would the reader's experiences for the resume, and I would say like get like your big numbers or like your big achievements on the left third of your resume, because that's where people scan their eyes through first, and then that's when they start moving their eyes to the right.
Those are awesome tips, Melody. Thank you for sharing those. I think that's sort of generally a really nice and concise way to sum up what I had just talked about. User experience is the most important thing. So be thoughtful about the person who's going to be reviewing and reading your resume when you're putting it together. let's transition over to the essays, which is personally one of my favorite parts of reviewing an application. I think they're really an opportunity for applicants to bring some color and some life into the application. The rest of the data points are really factual, right? Your test score, if you have one, your GPAs, your work experience, your undergrad institution. Yes, they all contribute to your overall story as an applicant, but they're just facts. The essays are really one of the aspects of the application where you have the most control. So you should be spending some time completing your essays. My biggest tips here, and these are general tips for any business school as you consider whether or not to be thoughtful about submitting your essays. So understand the prompt and answer the question directly. I know that sounds a little bit elementary and sort of trivial, but it's truly the most important tip. You would be amazed how many essays that we review and they don't actually address the prompt or the question. Every school asks their essay questions intentionally and they're very thoughtful about the information that they're trying to get from the applicant. So make sure that you're addressing the prompt. My next tip is to tell us your story in an authentic way. I oftentimes find that applicants will almost put on sort of this business school hat and they think that they need to draft their essays and paint this picture of what a business school wants them to present. And truly, we want you to be your authentic and genuine self. I want to understand what motivates you, how you got to where you are today, where you see yourself going in the future, and how this specific program fits into that overall story. So be authentic and genuine in your responses for your essays. Spend time on your essays and do your research. Your first draft should not be the draft that you submit with your essay. You should be iterating your essays probably 2 or 3 times at least before you submit your final draft. This is going to oftentimes require you to be very thoughtful and introspective and really think about, again, your path and your progression and where you see yourself going in the future and why you're applying to that specific program. Schools will have essays that are oftentimes goal-oriented or goal-focused, and then sometimes they're very specific to that program and why you're applying there. Other schools might give you a more creative opportunity. And I think with all of those, being thoughtful and introspective and really doing your research before you approach those essays will help you as you complete the essay prompts across every different program that you're applying to. My next question or my next tip, don't share your essay submissions for another school. I can't tell you how often it's most oftentimes in our optional essay that I'll get an essay submission that I know is for one of our peer schools. We're aware of what other schools are asking for their essays. So I know when I see an essay submission that was written for another program, and even if it's the best essay that you've ever drafted, keep it on that school's application. We don't need to see it. And my last tip is for the optional essay, because I oftentimes I get questions a lot of the time about the optional essay and whether or not it should be utilized, what it's used for, what's it's not supposed to be used for. And the optional essay is just that, it is optional. So if you truly have nothing additional to add, I think it's totally okay to leave it blank. But you should be using it if you need to explain anything that you feel the admissions team may have outstanding questions about. That might be a gap in your work experience. That might be a course that you didn't do well in undergrad. It might be why you have withdrawals on your transcript. It might be why you're deciding to apply in round 3. It might be why you're choosing the person that you've selected to be your reference and your letter of recommendation. All of those things are fair and valid reasons to submit an optional essay. But if you don't really feel like anything warrants additional explanation or there's no sort of flags in your candidacy, it's totally okay to leave it blank. I'd like to talk a little bit more specifically about the essays that we are asking here at Johnson. The first is our goals essay, which is more of a statement. As you can see here, it's really short and actually sort of fill in the blank. And the reason for that is because we want applicants to be very intentional about and specific for us about where they see themselves going immediately after the MBA and then 5 or 10 years down the road where they would like to be. It's important that you're choosing a school that can give you the platform to transition into whatever it is that you're hoping to do after business school. And we want to make sure that we're a program that can support you and give you the resources that you need to get where you want to go. So You don't need to be married to these by any means, but again, we're very intentionally asking you to be very specific so that we can understand where ideally you see yourself going after business school and that we have the resources to support you. We do also give applicants a brief opportunity to explain a little bit, especially because oftentimes we do understand that business school candidates are looking to transition industry functions, sometimes both. And maybe what you're looking to do after business school is not really connected to your current professional background or even your undergraduate experience. So we want to make sure that we give candidates an opportunity to give us additional context and help us understand where these came from and how has your current experience prepared you to pursue these goals. Our next essay is our impact essay, which is my personal favorite. One of the real common threads among the students in the program here at Johnson is this organic and genuine desire to give back. Our students are very actively looking for ways to contribute and give back and get involved in the community, lead different clubs or organizations, or start new organizations. So the impact essay is the applicant's opportunity to help us understand how they see themselves contributing and getting involved here. What aspects of the curriculum excite you? What extracurricular activities do you see yourself joining or hoping to get involved with? And what kind of meaningful impact would you hope to have on maybe here at Johnson or any elite business school community? That's the purpose of the impact essay. So yes, it does ask you to perhaps do a little bit more homework and due diligence into the specific program and the resources here more specifically, but that will just be for your benefit as you consider which program might be the best fit for you. Those are my best tips for approaching the essays. I'd again like to turn over to Melody and see if she has any tips as she approached her own business school application essays.
Yeah, I have a lot of tips. With the essay, I think this is the part of the application where it really shows the school whether you've done your homework, your due diligence, as Chelsea said, and like how you imagine yourself at the school. For me, like I talked to a lot of different students. I've talked to alumni. When I was a prospective student, I attended Johnson Women in Business. I don't know if any of you had attended that, but that was one of the ways I engage with students. I've also seen different people use LinkedIn. So if you go on LinkedIn, have a chat with Johnson students who are similar to you in background in like whether that is your personal background or your professional background or even similar schools, I would connect with those students because then they might ultimately have that similar experience that you might have when you're a student. So I would try to do that. I had one prospective student that I talked to. He's Asian American and like myself. And when I talked to him, he told me that I was the first Asian person that he connected with. And that led to like a gap in sharing like what his experience at Johnson could be, like things that would align with what he valued. So I would do that if you have time to. I would, another thing with the essay is the process of drafting the essay. For me, like I leveraged a lot of people that I knew, like my friends, my family, friends who write as their jobs. So they were the ones who were able to help me edit my essays and make sure that my grammar was good, everything was concise, that I was talking about myself. And when you're talking about yourself, like highlight yourself, like highlight the things that really fascinate you about Johnson. Use active voice if you can, because that shows that you are proactive about the kind of story that you want to, that the kind of story that this MBA can mean for your next 2 years and even for the rest of your life. So think about that. And then on top of that, like for something like the impact essay, imagine what 2 years at Johnson will be like. And I think that also comes through your coffee chats and informationals with different Johnson students and alum. Like, what is it like to be part of like the Women's Management Council, or like if you want to be part of the wine club, like what is that like? Or if there are certain initiatives you want to drive, does Johnson already have those initiatives in place? And if they have already been in place, like what is the state of that initiative? So talk to as many people as you can. I know the deadline's approaching, but if you have time, to try to find people on LinkedIn or connect with Johnson students that you already know.
Melody hit on two really great tips and pieces of advice. And the first is absolutely use the people in your network, your friends and your family. Give your essay submissions to someone that you know and have them review it and have them check, as she mentioned, for spelling and grammar, but also if this sounds like you. Is this something that you would actually submit? Is this an authentic and genuine essay for you? And maybe have them guess what the question or the prompt is, so that you get a sense for whether or not you've actually answered the question. The second thing she hit on that I think is a great piece of advice is connecting with the community. I think that that's probably the most helpful and valuable thing that you can do to get an understanding for what that experience might look like for you, which actually leads me to the next slide on my overview here, related to community and the type of experience you're looking for. This is really something that you want to be very thoughtful about. If you select a school based on rankings or websites or data and numbers, that might be a very different experience than perhaps the one that you thought it would be, or the one that you were hoping to have. So you should be selecting a program based on which community and environment you fit best in. So as Melody mentioned, chatting with students and alums is probably the best way to get a good understanding for the type of experience you're looking for. What size program would work best for you? What type of area or location are you hoping to be in? Do you want to be in a smaller college town environment, or do you want to be in a major metropolitan area? And neither one of those is right or wrong or better or worse. They're just very different. So doing some of that due diligence up front will give you a good understanding for which programs you should actually be applying to, and whether or not that experience would be a good fit for you. So taking Melody's advice to connect with students and alums will not only help you approach the essays, it'll also help you with your interview and the decision-making process at the end of which community you truly want to be a part of. Let's transition over to letters of recommendation, which I think in my experience here, I probably got the most questions about letters of recommendation. So let's hopefully talk through some of those, any outstanding questions that you all have. The first thing that you should do is take a look at the schools that you're applying to and how many recommendations you would need to submit. What is the required number? At Johnson, we actually only require one. We will accept up to 2. So the second is optional. Other programs are not that way. Other programs require 2 as a minimum, and they will accept up to 3. So when you're thinking about who to select, you'll need to first understand how many you need to select. We always, and this extends beyond just Johnson, but most top business schools will first prefer a current or a recent supervisor. The person that truly oversees your work is able to give us the valuable content that we're actually looking for when we're reviewing a letter of recommendation. I see lots of good letters of recommendation, and that's good. There's nothing wrong with that, but it's not often that you see a great letter of recommendation, and a great letter of recommendation truly can be submitted by a current or a former supervisor, someone who really knows the details of your work. Keep them professional, which is truly the biggest underlying tip. If you're maybe an undergrad or you've recently graduated, choose an internship supervisor, or maybe a graduate assistantship or a teaching assistantship supervisor, someone who knows you in a professional setting. You do not want to select anyone from an academic setting, like a former professor. They really they don't give the same type of content that we're looking for from the letters of recommendation. If you're an entrepreneur or a family business applicant and you don't have a current or a former supervisor, or maybe your current or your former supervisor is a member of your direct family and you're wondering if whether or not that's a conflict of interest and you should stay away from that, the answer to that is yes, you should probably stay away from that. But if you are in those situations, oftentimes a client actually submits a really strong letter of recommendation. So that's what I would advise. Some of my tips to prepare your recommenders. First, give them time. So whatever the deadline is that you're shooting for, tell them that it's a week before. These are oftentimes, they're very busy people, and this is probably not the first thing on their priority list. Letters of recommendation is probably the biggest thing that holds an application from being complete and actually meeting the deadline. So give them a little bit of flexibility there with whatever the deadline is that you're shooting for. The second tip that I would say is to verbally remind them of all of the wonderful things that you've done in your professional career. This is not the time for self-doubt. You should be confident and you should be betting on yourself in this process. So verbally remind them of your recent accomplishments, your achievements, teams that you've worked on, leadership projects that you've had, budgets that you've managed, revenue, any sales, anything, any additional context and data points that you can give them to help them incorporate that into the letter. Don't write it for them. We see that happen a lot, and we can actually pretty easily tell whether the letter came from you or if it came from a different voice. This is the only part of the application that is objective, and it's somebody else speaking for you on your behalf. So you do want to make sure that you're choosing the right person and that they're providing the content that we like to see when we evaluate letters of recommendation. Let's move over to the admissions interview. So the interview you will probably need to be very specific about depending on the school and the program. Most schools will have a different format and modality and timeline for admissions interviews. At Johnson, ours are invitation only. It's not the same at other programs. Some of them will give you an open interview period where you can self-initiate an admissions interview. At Johnson, though, ours are invitation only. They can be done virtually via Zoom, or you can join us here on campus to do your interview if you would like to do a visit. The interviewer could be a member of the admissions team or a trained second-year student. Other programs might do a team-based interview experience. Other programs might do an alum interviewer, whomever it is that's interviewing you, staff member, student, alum, or a group, you should still treat the interview the same way. You should treat it professionally. You should have prepared questions for the interviewer, and you should answer the question the same way, whether it's a staff member or a student or an alum that's conducting the interview. Oftentimes we're all trained the same way. We go through the same training process in order to interview. So really doesn't matter who it is that's conducting the interview. My tips for a successful interview, again, number one, treat it professionally. Number two, you should be authentic in your responses, similar to the way that you complete your essays in the application. You should be yourself, be prepared to be thoughtful and connect the dots about your path and your progression to date, where you see yourself going and why that specific program is of interest to you. You should also come prepared with thoughtful questions specific to the person interviewing you. So if I'm your admissions interview, you shouldn't be asking me my favorite part of the program or what clubs I was involved in, because I'm a staff member and I'm not an alum or a current student in the program. Finally, I think this is most important for virtual interviews, but you should be checking and testing your audio and your video in advance of that conversation. It's really disappointing to tell a candidate that we have 30 minutes together or 45 minutes together or whatever it is, and the first 10 minutes is monopolized by the candidate troubleshooting their technical difficulties. So please be sure that you check all of those and that they're clear and ready to go in advance of that conversation so that you can use the most of the time that you have together. My last tip is that interviews are an opportunity for, yes, us to get a sense for your potential fit for the program here, but you should also be using the interview as an opportunity to understand whether or not this is the place where you want to be. So use it to ask those tough questions or the questions that you haven't gotten answers for yet. You should walk away from that conversation with more information about the program and the experience than you had going in. Again, I'd like to turn it over to Melody to share any of her tips or pieces of advice as she conducted her business school admissions interviews.
Totally +1 on everything you said, Chelsea. Yeah, like definitely use that time to get to know your interviewer. I think of like a lot of times it's a student who's interviewing, and I mean, even the admissions team, it's like you have to think of them as people at the end of the day. Like these are people who, if they volunteer to interview, these are people who are very passionate about Johnson. So I think like it is, and it's like if you're passionate about something and you get a chance to talk about it, that's like a really good, like it's like a way to perk up their day. So if you're able to ask those hard-hitting questions where they can really highlight like why the school is great, I would do that during the interview. One tip that I always give people with the interview is to be very structured and concise. That was like something that I was not 100% that I didn't 100% nail down, and like in business school we definitely drilled that in, but whenever you can, like keep it as structured as possible. Like also be answer first. So if I were to ask like why MBA, you should give me that answer up front, and then you can deep dive into the answer, so that I can have that answer top of mind as you're going through all the reasons why the MBA makes sense. So yeah, be concise. Like I've coached like different friends who are applying for MBAs, and even like different mocks that I've given, like the more concise you can be, the more time you can talk about various aspects of yourself, and also the more time you can have to do that Q&A at the end with whoever's interviewing you.
That's such a great tip. Yes, especially and something I should have talked about, but be mindful of how much time that you have together. So you should be concise. You should absolutely be answering the question and giving a little bit of context and helpful detail. But if you're taking 5 to 8 minutes to answer one question, the interviewer is only going to be able to ask you maybe 3 or 4 questions in the entire 30 minutes that you have together. So certainly take Melody's advice and be concise and structured in your responses. That's a really great tip. I'd like now to turn it over to Melody to share a little bit about her path and why she ultimately chose Johnson. So we talked a little bit earlier about being thoughtful about the type of business school experience that you're looking for and the type of community where you'll fit best. I would love if Melody could share more about what really were the aspects of the decision-making process that were most important to her when she was applying to business school, and what led her to ultimately choose Johnson, and maybe some highlights of her experience here.
Okay, cool. Happy to share. So I chose Johnson for a few different reasons. I really liked that it was small. I really enjoyed the dynamic of the students and the admissions as I was going through the whole process. And I really, yeah, it's like I like that those were the like 2 main things, and I knew that like it was going to help me get to where I needed to be, or where I wanted to be with my career. So dialing back a little bit, like going into my background, because I didn't get a chance to do that. So before my MBA, I attended Temple University in Philadelphia, where I had a background in biology. And then right after college, I spent a few years at Booz Allen Hamilton, where I was a federal consultant. So based from that background, like there was no business experience at all. So I realized that in order for me to propel my career and ultimately become a leader, I needed to get a business degree to be able to understand how business leaders are making decisions, what they have top of mind, and then also build out how I am as a leader. So when I looked at different schools, being in Philadelphia, there's a lot of schools within a 2-hour radius from me. And so I was originally thinking like, hey, let me go to school at a city. But when I visited Cornell, it was just like a very different dynamic that I did not see in the other schools that I thought would be like immediate, obvious choices. One thing that I really liked about Johnson being really small is that you get to really connect with all of your classmates to the extent that you want to. I have some classmates who are very introverted, so they had a different approach with how they wanted to connect with their classmates. But for me, like, I wanted to be able to, it's like if I saw your name, I want to at least know like what you're recruiting for at the very minimum, and maybe like some of the things that you're involved in. So Johnson being really small, I really like that I could put a face to the name of all my classmates. And I think like that really helps make a lot of warm connections, whether you're preparing for interviews, whether you're interested in getting involved in a certain like club or activity. Even as an alum, so Uber is my second job coming out of Johnson. My first was at Visa. And with Uber, and even like all the different things that I applied for last year, they were all through referrals from the Johnson Alumni Network. And when I was making decisions across all my offers, I talked to a lot of my classmates about whether I should go for one avenue or another. So I really like how like classmates not only pay it forward while they're on campus, but they also do it like when we've all graduated. So I really liked the dynamic of the whole entire student body. And I saw that when I was a prospective student, where kind of different from what I observed at different schools. It was like, I was like, hey, I came from Booz Allen, or I came from Federal Consulting. And they were immediately able to plug me to people who had those similar backgrounds to talk about like how they thought about their application process. Why did an MBA make sense, given that a lot of the things that people go into post MBA is very different from where we came from. So I think like the way that we are all a community on campus and beyond is something that I really liked about Johnson. And I think another thing, I know a lot of people are very, they're like, hey, it's because it's a small town and like, I don't know how I feel about that. And I think it actually adds a lot to the community, like the way that's structured. And it's like we all end up living in like the same buildings or like in very close proximity to each other. So that means that we're more likely to bump into each other. Whereas I'm in New York City right now, and the likelihood of me bumping into a classmate is very slim because there's 10 million people in the city. I do have a classmate that lives right across the street from me. So this morning I like helped her walk her dog while she's on a business trip. But it's like I like that the way that Ithaca is structured allows us to really engage with each other, so that on a Friday, Saturday night, or even Thursday, when we're done with our classes, done with our assignments, and we want to just socialize, it's so easy for us to like come together. It's like 10-15 minute radius of each other. Whereas like in New York City, for example, it can take like 30 minutes to an hour to get to the destination that we're all trying to congregate at. So I think the structure of where we are kind of meets what we end up building. And then do you want me to talk about my Johnson experience, or?
I would love that. If there's any highlights that really stand out for you, clubs you were involved in, projects you worked on, international trips, whatever was really a standout for you, that would be amazing.
Okay. There's a lot. So one thing I really also like about Johnson, it's that it's entrepreneurial and humble. It's entrepreneurial because we are a small community. So it's not like we have all the staff to be able to drive every single thing that we want to see in the community. So sometimes it does require students to be able to drive that and be able to take their vision and turn it into action. And I think that's a great opportunity for you to build out different skill sets. Like Johnson is one of the schools where it is kind of like an incubator for different ways to develop who you are as a leader. So if there's something that you're very interested in, if you see an opportunity in that school, you could go ahead and make it happen. and find all the stakeholders that you need to drive that idea home. One thing I did when in my last year at Johnson was, as an Asian American, I noticed that we have 5-6 clubs for different cultures and ethnicities, whereas like with other groups, like they had an international and a domestic org. So I noticed that there's so many different orgs, and I realized that one thing that we could do is find a way to kind of build an umbrella or bridges across all the different orgs so that they're connected and that they have a way of kind of like leveraging each other's resources and understanding that in the US, we're all under this Asian umbrella. So I worked with ODI on that. I worked with like the first years who would end up driving that idea after I graduated. So it really requires having conversations with different people and seeing like where there's an opportunity to make your vision come to life. I also like that Johnson was very pay it forward. It's like I think it's part of the fact that like second years are so involved in how in like the different clubs in our recruiting experiences, that like when you do become a second year, you end up like paying it forward to the first years under you. So I really like how there's like a community in every aspect of the experience. In terms of fun things, I really enjoyed the international trips. I highly recommend doing that because it's like a way to explore different aspects of a different country that I feel like if I were to go on a trip on my own, I would not be able to experience. So for the treks that I did Israel, where we had 90 students on 2 tour buses, and we were able to hit all the different historical sites and cities in Israel. Also got to learn about how different types of people in Israel think about their place in that state and like the businesses that have spurred from their experiences. I also did the Africa trek in South Africa and Ghana. And like 2 of my best friends in my year, they were the ones who led the trek and put together the itinerary and everything. And it was a way to see like Africa in a very different way that I had not been aware of, given that I had not been to Africa at all. So I think like definitely like join the international trips if you can. Join the clubs that really fascinate you. They're like a great way to socialize with all your classmates in different contexts outside of the classroom. So Sage Social on Thursdays are a great way to mingle with everybody, a way for everyone to just forget about classes, forget about recruiting, and just like hang out with each other even like afterwards. So there's a lot of different ways for you to get involved. There's also like the holiday events like Carnival and Diwali, where like that's also like a big party for you to like hang out with your classmates. So there's a lot of different ways to be involved. And then from a diversity standpoint, because that's something that really that I'm really passionate about, I really love seeing the Johnson Women in Business and Johnson Means Business events, because it's like a way for you to connect with prospective students who are really interested in the schools, and then they're also kind of trying to find like where they fit into the community. So I really like being able to like mentor people and to kind of like pay it forward and make sure that like they feel like they can feel at home in this space. So I think like those events are also things that I look forward to at Johnson.
That's awesome, Melody. Thank you. You did a really nice job highlighting the culture and the ethos here and the community and really what the experience could look like. I love that you talked about how almost everything at Johnson is student driven. And I think that that's probably something that a lot of our students don't realize until it's a little bit too late and they're sort of on their way out of the program. But Melody's absolutely right. So many of the resources and the opportunities that exist here today were started or initiated by current students. So if you're able to start your MBA program with that level of understanding, you're really able to make an impact and see where there might be gaps or holes in the experience and opportunities to innovate. So thank you very much for sharing your highlights and what ultimately led you to choose Johnson.
Yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, I really enjoyed my Johnson experience. I'm very thankful for the experience. So I really hope that if you are able to go through the process with Johnson and you ultimately choose Johnson, that you can also see that as well.
Perfect. Thank you. We have about 10 minutes remaining, so would love to dive into the Q&A box with the remaining time today and just answer a couple of questions. So Melody and I have both been in here answering some on the back end typing, but we're going to take a couple and answer them aloud. So Melody, anything specific to like the student experience, I'll pass over to you, but there's a couple specific to the application process and admission. So I'd like to address those. The first one I see here is whether or not we at Johnson offer an application fee waiver for round 3 applicants that have been impacted by tech layoffs. The answer to that is yes, we do. You should email a copy of your resume to mba@johnson.cornell.edu, which is our main admissions inbox, and a member of our team will review your resume and be in touch with you. There's another question here about work experience and how that impacts somebody's candidacy and overall application. So the question is, for those with no previous industry experience, what are the other factors that we look for when deciding on admission for the candidate? And work experience, our average years of experience is 5. The middle 80% range, I would say, is somewhere between maybe 3 years of experience all the way up to 7 or 8 years of experience. And if you are under that, maybe 2 to 3 years of experience, what you should be thoughtful about highlighting in your application is what contributions you would make to your MBA teams and what value you would add to classroom discussions and the overall experience of your peers. So much of business school learning is actually not faculty to student. Yes, there's value there, but so much of it actually comes from learning from your peers and your team. So you should be prepared to highlight projects that you've managed, any leadership experiences that you've had, teams that you've worked on, if you've worked cross-functionally or cross-culturally. All of those things can be helpful for the person reading your application to get a sense for the value and the contributions that you would bring to your overall classroom and classmate experience. Couple of questions about the GRE that I'm just going to address all of them here. Yes, we do take the GMAT or the GRE. We do not publish the average GRE score, and the reason why is because we actually internally convert them to GMATs when we evaluate them to make sure that we are evaluating all candidates equally. So we don't publish our middle 80% or our average GRE score, but if you're looking for a range, the average is probably somewhere in the mid 160s, maybe 165 on the quant and the verbal. A couple questions about application fee waivers. If you're interested in an application fee waiver, you should actually head over to our admissions event page and plan to join us for one of our upcoming Ask Admissions sessions. There's a question here, Melody, that I'm wondering if you can help respond to, and it's related to the New York City campus, which I think was open when you were in the program. But the question is, can you elaborate about the difference between Ithaca and New York City? Can you talk about maybe some of the classes that one would take at our New York City campus on Roosevelt Island, and maybe whether or not that would be of value to anybody's experience? It was something I didn't talk about at all in my presentation.
Okay. I didn't take any classes at the New York City campus, but I I think there's also like, I think the AMBAs are there now, like in the upcoming years. So I have been to New York City campus, and only like to visit. I think at least for the 2-year full-time MBA, the people who would take classes on the New York City campus, they are doing like I forget what it's called, but like they're doing like a tech focused kind of session for half a semester in their second year. So there was the option of doing fintech or digital marketing. And my classmates spent like half a semester there during our last year in the spring. But yeah, like I mean, being there, for like different things, I mean, it's a pretty cool campus. It wouldn't be, I don't think like for full-time, we necessarily have our core classes there. Like not like the first semester core classes, but like a lot of our electives there. I just know that my classmates took their like fintech and digital marketing classes there if they sign up for that specific curriculum.
Perfect. Yes. The tech campus is really exciting. There, as Melody mentioned, there are some tech focused intensives there that are half a semester, fintech and digital marketing, but really the candidates or the students in the program that are taking advantage of the opportunities to study on our New York City campus are very tech or digital tech focused. They want to go into maybe product management or product marketing post MBA, maybe work at a startup or start their own tech-focused startup. So as you can see from Melody's experience, really you don't have to go to the New York City campus to work in tech. Melody's at Uber, but you certainly could if you wanted to maybe expand your network and collaborate with other students that are fully based on our New York City campus, or if you just had some space for additional electives and you wanted to broaden the scope of some of the classes that you were taking. Couple more questions here. Maybe time for one or two more. Question about letters of recommendation. If a current supervisor is not available and out of the country, will it impact an application? Not necessarily. And I should have probably highlighted this when I talked about letters of recommendation, but there are multiple reasons why maybe your current supervisor is not the best person to write your letter of recommendation or not in a place to submit a letter of recommendation on your behalf. It's possible that maybe they've only supervised you for a short period of time and your former supervisor knows much more about your work. It's also possible that maybe they are abroad and out of the country and they're or on maternity leave and they're not paternity leave and they're not accessible and you're not able to reach them at this point in time, or maybe they don't know that you're applying to business school. And if you were to tell them, that could jeopardize an upcoming promotion or any progression or opportunity at work. And all of those are valid reasons. I would say just put a quick bullet point in your optional essay and help us understand why you're not choosing your current supervisor. We see it all the time though. It's not uncommon and it's not something that's going to negatively impact your candidacy.
I mean, I don't know about the admission part for the entrepreneurship thing, but I have a lot of classmates who came into Johnson with the only intention of going into entrepreneurship. So what I've seen with people who did that was similar to how like me, who was only looking to go into strategy or consulting. I knew what the path towards recruiting for that looked like. So for entrepreneurship, you have to come in with knowing how you will drive that exploration for yourself. You might not have that business idea yet, but at least like knowing what resources school has to offer, how you will carve out that path, the way that other students who are in a structured recruiting process has a structured path, is something that you will have to articulate so that the school knows that the MBA is a worthwhile path for you in your entrepreneurship journey.
Thank you for highlighting that, Melody. Entrepreneurship at Cornell is something that's probably not talked about as much as it should be. The resources here are tremendous. We have, as Melody mentioned, lots of students that are here specifically focused on starting or launching a business, and lots of opportunities to mentor and get involved with maybe funding or advising startups that are happening on campus, even if maybe you're not looking to start your own business. So definitely take a look at entrepreneurship at Cornell. It's actually like a university-wide theme and initiative, but take a look at that. And the last question I'll answer is, I see it here a couple of times, is related to tracking attendance. And the reason I want to talk about this is because event attendance, visiting schools, connections with the community, those are all things that are for your benefit as the candidate. They're things that, yes, show us interest and that you're engaged, but it's not something that's going to impact an admissions decision. Connections with our community and touch points with our program are things that you all should be doing to do your research and your due diligence and get a good understanding for the experience and whether or not this would be a good fit for you. So we don't really track it formally. It's not, again, something that would go into your application or into your admissions decision, but not something that you should avoid either. And with that, we are actually at time for today. So I'd like to thank Melody for joining us and sharing her tips and her insights, and thank all of you for spending an hour with us today.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I wish you best of luck with your whole MBA journey, and hope to see you around.